Welcome back to Lessons from the Fall. Today's episode starts with a question that I've been asked directly, a question I've been asked indirectly, and a question I've seen written online, a question I've heard whispered in conversation, and if I'm being honest, it's a question I've asked myself. Can people really change? Not improve, not mature, not learn a new skill, not become more successful. Can people fundamentally change? Can someone become a different person from who they once were? It's a question that sits at the center of almost every redemption story, every comeback story, every second chance. Because we all say we believe in chance until somebody actually changes. Then suddenly we're not so sure. Society has an interesting relationship with failure. We celebrate redemption in movies, we admire it in books, we applaud it in documentaries. But when it's actually happening in real life, it's much more complicated because real change makes people uncomfortable. If someone changes, what does that mean for the story we've been telling ourselves about them? And maybe that's why some people struggle with it. It's easier to keep people in a box. It's easier to say, that's who they are, that's what they did. People never change. Because if people can change, then life becomes more complicated, more nuanced, more human. And I understand both sides of that argument because I've lived both sides of it. I've been the person people judge, and I've also been the person that judges other people. The truth is, change sounds beautiful, but living through it is painful because real change isn't motivational quotes. It's not social media posts. It's not saying you're sorry. Real change is uncomfortable. It's waking up every day and making different decisions over and over for years. It's rebuilding trust slowly, without guarantees, without applause, without certainty that anyone will ever recognize the effort. That's the part people don't see. They see the outcome, they don't see the work. And the work is where change actually happens. I've often thought about my father, Dr. Prasad. If he was sitting across from me today, what would we talk about? What would we understand each other's differences? Would I see things differently? Would he? I actually don't know. What I do know is that age gives you perspective. As a young man, I spent a lot of my time trying to understand my father, his decisions, his expectations, his strengths, his flaws, his infidelities. Now, as a father myself, I spend more time trying to understand how difficult life can be. Because the older I get, the less interested I become in judging people, and the more interested I become in understanding them. Not excusing behavior, understanding it, because they're not the same thing. You can hold people accountable and still recognize their humanity. You can acknowledge mistakes and still believe in growth. You can recognize failure and still support redemption. Those ideas can exist together. And I think we've lost some of that. Today, people are often defined by their worst moment, their biggest mistake, their lowest point. Imagine if that's how we measured everyone. Imagine if every person listening to this podcast was judged forever by the worst thing they've ever done. How many of us would survive that test? How many of us would want to? The reality is, most of us are grateful we're not measured solely by our mistakes. We're measured by what happens next, by what we learn, by how we respond, by whether we continue repeating the same behavior or choosing a different path. And that's why I believe people can change. Not because it's easy, not because everyone does, but because I've seen it. I've seen people rebuild their lives. I've seen people recover from addiction. I've seen people repair relationships. I've seen people become better parents, better partners, and better leaders. And I've seen people choose not to change. That's the important distinction. Change is possible. It's not automatic. It requires honesty, accountability, humility, consistency. And those things are hard, especially accountability, Because accountability requires you to stop blaming everyone else, to stop explaining everything anyway, and to stop seeing yourself as a victim of every story, and instead ask, what could I have done differently? What do I need to own? What needs to change? Those questions aren't comfortable, but they're necessary. I've sat across from billionaires, I've sat across from investors, I've sat across from people who have built extraordinary lives. And one thing that they almost have in common, they take responsibility. Not for everything, but for their part. And that's where growth begins. Not with access, not with money, not with recognition. Responsibility. Because once you take responsibility, you gain power to change. And maybe that's the answer to today's question. Can people really change? Yes, but only if they're willing to take responsibility for who they were and commit to becoming someone better. Not for a week, not for a month, not for appearances, for life. Because change isn't an event, it's a practice, a daily decision, a choice you make over and over again. This is Lessons from the Fall, and maybe the most important lesson I've learned in this. People are not defined by the worst chapters of their story. They're defined by whether they keep writing after it. Thanks for listening.